Did you know there are black neighborhoods in London where average home values quietly clear seven figures, family money compounds behind terraced doors, and success isn't earned but inherited? Let's explore 8 of such richest black neighborhoods in the city, starting with the most overlooked and ending where the real power sits. Number 8. Lewisham and Deptford. Market money to property power. Lewisham wears its black identity openly, but its wealth story is far more subtle than people expect. This part of southeast London became a Caribbean stronghold after the war, later joined by large West and Central African communities. Apart from its prevalent black culture, what sets Lewisham and Deptford apart is how many families here used commerce as a stepping stone for getting rich. Walk through Deptford Market and you'll still see the legacy. Food stalls, hair supply shops, tailors, fishmongers. But what often goes unseen is what came next. Market traders became wholesalers. One-chair barbershops expanded into multi-location salons. Informal catering turned into registered food businesses, supplying events, schools, and offices. These weren't venture-backed startups, but incremental expansions fueled by trust and cash flow. Property values also underline this shift. Lewisham's average home price now sits around £550,000, with Riverside and new build areas in Deptford pushing higher. Many black families bought ex-council properties here in the 80s and 90s at deep discounts. Over time, those homes became collateral, leveraged to open businesses, fund education, or acquire rental properties nearby. There's also a noticeable return pattern. Black professionals who leave for work often come back to Lewisham to buy. NHS consultants, architects, civil servants, fintech workers, people who want space without disconnecting from the neighborhood. That return flow keeps capital local. It's why Lewisham still supports a dense ecosystem of black-owned gyms, cafes, churches, and co-working spaces, even as regeneration pushes prices up. Median incomes vary widely, but the borough consistently produces asset-rich households, particularly among second-generation families. What I find striking is how wealth here stays relational. People invest together, they renovate together. They share information about planning permissions, grants, and school catchments, like it's family news. Lewisham shows what happens when black wealth grows outward instead of upward. But in London, you will also find rich black neighborhoods that choose an entirely different strategy. Number 7. Peckham, Southwark. From survival capital to strategic wealth. Peckham has always been loud culturally, but financially, its story is far more deliberate than outsiders assume. People see murals, music, markets, and energy and assume chaos. Residents, on the other hand, tend to see price per square foot, catchment areas, transport upgrades, and timing. That gap in perception is where Peckham's black wealth quietly grew. Historically, Peckham became a hub for Caribbean migrants, followed by strong West African communities, particularly Nigerian, Ghanaian, and Sierra Leonean families, who brought with them a very specific relationship to money: pragmatic, communal, and long-term. Wealth here was never about individual display. It was about collective survival first, then strategic accumulation. In 2011, parts of this neighborhood recorded over 50% Black African and Caribbean populations, and while that percentage has shifted with gentrification, the economic footprint hasn't disappeared. It's evolved. Rye Lane remains a commercial artery packed with black-owned hair salons, food shops, travel agencies, and retailers. But the real story sits behind those shopfronts. Families own property above the store, around the corner, or 2 postcodes away. Ownership here is layered, not singular, and the numbers back that up. Average property prices now sit around £600,000 to £700,000, with renovated Victorian terraces pushing well beyond that. Many black households bought when prices were a fraction of today's values, often through pooled family resources. One aunt's savings, a cousin's credit profile, a brother's trade skills handling renovations. Together, those pieces turned into equity. It's a model that doesn't show up neatly in estate agent brochures, but it has produced real, measurable wealth. What makes Peckham especially compelling is how entrepreneurial income feeds asset growth. Retail profits become deposits. Rental income funds, education. Education loops back into professional careers in law, tech, finance, and consulting. Today, it's common to see second-generation Peckham kids working in Canary Wharf or the city, then deliberately buying locally to stay close to family networks. That choice keeps wealth circulating instead of exporting it. Gentrification complicates the picture, of course. Rising prices, new developments, cultural tension, all real. But unlike neighborhoods where displacement hollowed communities out, Peckham still has a dense black middle-class holding ground. They renovate instead of relocating. They subdivide instead of selling. They rent out rather than cash out. That single decision to hold has preserved millions in intergenerational wealth. Compared to Brixton, which often carried the weight of being a cultural symbol, Peckham operated more like a spreadsheet. Less myth, more math. And that's why today, when you look past the noise, Peckham doesn't just feel culturally rich, it looks financially formidable. Number 6. Tottenham, Haringey. The long game neighborhood. Next up, we have Tottenham, a neighborhood that rarely gets framed as a carrier of black wealth, which is exactly why it deserves a closer look. The narrative around this area tends to freeze somewhere between Windrush-era migration and moments of unrest, but that framing ignores a much quieter reality playing out on residential streets that never make the news. Tottenham is where a significant number of black Londoners stayed put, bought early, and let time do most of the heavy lifting. Post-1950s, Tottenham became home to Caribbean families working in transport, healthcare, manufacturing, and local government. These weren't high-paying jobs, but they were stable, unionized, and consistent. That consistency mattered. Home ownership rates among black Caribbean households in this area rose steadily through the 1970s and 80s, when property prices were low enough to make buying possible on modest incomes. What looked like survival at the time slowly turned into leverage. Today, average house prices across Tottenham range from £500,000 to £650,000, with hotspots around Tottenham Hale climbing higher due to regeneration and transport links. Many black families here own homes outright, sometimes more than one, either through inheritance or early purchases. I've heard people describe relatives who worked as bus drivers or nurses retiring as accidental millionaires, not because they chased wealth, but because they never sold. The stadium redevelopment accelerated this shift. Billions poured into infrastructure, retail, and housing, and land values followed. Yet many black homeowners didn't exit. They refinanced, they rented rooms, they converted properties into multi-unit homes. This is asset-heavy wealth, low flash, high resilience. Median incomes in Haringey still sit around £36,000 to £40,000, which often misleads outsiders. Income doesn't tell the whole story when equity is doing the real work. The wealth here lives in deeds, not payslips. Add to that a dense network of black-led churches, community groups, and trade connections that quietly circulate opportunities. Construction contracts, caregiving businesses, small logistics operations, and you begin to see how money stays close. And so, Tottenham is less about arriving rich and more about staying long enough for the city to catch up to you. And once you understand that, the next rich neighborhood starts to make a different kind of sense. Number 5. Shepherd's Bush, Hammersmith and Fulham. Quiet West London money. The black population in Shepherd's Bush has never been interested in going mainstream, and that's not an accident. It's a strategy refined over decades. Sitting just minutes from Kensington, Holland Park, and Notting Hill, this part of West London developed a sizable African-Caribbean population that learned early how to coexist with wealth without being swallowed by it. Not assimilated, not erased, just positioned well enough to benefit quietly. The result is one of London's most understated black affluent zones. Roughly 24 to 25% of residents identify as Black African or Caribbean, but the surrounding borough tells the bigger story. Hammersmith and Fulham consistently ranks among London's higher income areas, with median household incomes north of £45,000 and average property prices hovering between £750,000 and £900,000. Higher still as you drift closer to Kensington borders. Black families who bought here in the 1980s and 1990s didn't just benefit from appreciation. They bought proximity to power long before that phrase became fashionable. And proximity matters more than people realize. Within a short walk or tube stop, you're surrounded by media headquarters, private healthcare providers, international law firms, advertising agencies, and multinational offices. That environment shapes career paths. Black residents here are disproportionately represented in professional services. Senior managers, consultants, architects, IT contractors, creatives with international client bases, and business owners whose revenue comes from well outside the neighborhood. The businesses aren't always visible on the high street, but the margins are often healthier. What's even more striking is the restraint. Homes are well kept but rarely extravagant. Extensions are sensible. Renovations are clean, not performative. Cars are practical, sometimes almost boring. The spending shows up elsewhere: private education, university abroad, property in the Caribbean or West Africa, investment flats, and long-haul travel. This is wealth that prioritizes optionality over attention. The goal isn't to be seen, it's to stay flexible. There's also a cultural confidence here that's hard to fake. Churches, barbers, Caribbean cafes, and African groceries still operate, not as nostalgia, but as infrastructure. They coexist comfortably with affluence. No one is trying to prove anything. Shepherd's Bush has been described to me as where Black London learned how to blend without disappearing, and that feels right. The community didn't vanish as wealth arrived, it simply adjusted its volume. Compared to places like Brixton or Peckham, where cultural visibility often came with commercial pressure, Shepherd's Bush chose a different path. It leaned into professional insulation rather than cultural centrality. That decision preserved stability. It also preserved wealth. And above this level, wealth doesn't adapt to the city anymore. It begins to subtly direct it. And now, we are halfway through this list of richest Black neighborhoods in London. And if these stories of industrial grit and billion-dollar ambition are inspiring you, consider dropping a super thanks. We are building Black status to be the ultimate archive of Black success, and your support helps us dig deeper, research harder, and tell the stories that mainstream media ignores. If you want to see more content about the architects of Black wealth, hit that super thanks button and help us grow. Let's continue with the video now. Number 4. Hackney, East London. Creative capital that refused to stay temporary. Hackney's Black wealth story doesn't begin with money. And that's the first thing people get wrong about it. It begins with proximity, to opportunity, to institutions, and to the kinds of jobs that don't always pay outrageously well at first, but quietly turn into long-term leverage if you stick around long enough. For decades, Hackney was a landing zone for Caribbean families pushed east by post-war housing policy, followed later by African migrants and Black British creatives priced out of more central boroughs. What they found wasn't glamour, it was access. Access to the city, to media firms, to universities, to the cultural industries that orbit Shoreditch, Clerkenwell, and later Silicon Roundabout. That access mattered more than prestige. Today, roughly 20 to 22% of Hackney residents identify as Black African or Caribbean, with a much larger global majority presence overall. But the real shift shows up in housing and profession. Average property prices now hover between £650,000 and £900,000, depending on the postcode, with pockets of Stoke Newington, London Fields, and Dalston regularly pushing past that. Many Black families bought when prices were a fraction of today's levels, sometimes through right to buy, sometimes through informal family pooling, sometimes simply by staying put when others left. What makes Hackney distinct is how money is earned. This is a borough dense with Black architects, senior designers, creative directors, producers, consultants, policy professionals, and tech-adjacent roles. These aren't viral careers, but they scale. They come with equity, partnerships, IP ownership, and long-term contracts. When paired with property ownership, that combination quietly creates seven-figure net worths without flash. There's also a rental economy beneath the surface. Garden studios turned into workspaces, multi-floor terraces split into income-generating units, short-term creative lets layered on top of long-term residential ownership. Hackney rewards people who understand zoning, planning permissions, and timing, not hype. What I find most interesting is that many Black professionals here didn't intend to build wealth. They intended to build careers. Wealth followed because they stayed long enough to own their environment, instead of renting it emotionally and financially. Hackney proves that creativity isn't fragile. It just needs permanence to compound. And once you understand that, the rest of London's Black wealth map starts to make a lot more sense. Number 3. Brixton, Lambeth, culture that accidentally became capital. Brixton is often described as the soul of Black Britain, but that description doesn't fully capture what's happened here economically. Culture didn't just survive in Brixton, it appreciated. And the families who stayed long enough to see that shift are sitting on some of the most quietly powerful wealth positions in South London. Post-Windrush, Brixton became a Caribbean stronghold shaped by music, food, activism, and trade. For decades, it was overlooked by investors, which ironically made it accessible. Black families bought homes, opened shops, and built institutions without competition from large developers. Fast forward to today, and Brixton sits minutes from central London with transport links, nightlife, and brand recognition money can't manufacture. Property prices now reflect that. Average homes in Brixton range from £650,000 to over £800,000, with prime pockets exceeding 7 figures. Many Black homeowners here bought in the 70s and 80s, some through council purchase schemes, and never left. What started as affordable housing turned into prime real estate simply by staying put. What's unique about Brixton is how cultural capital converted into financial leverage. The markets, venues, and food spots didn't just attract tourists. They attracted developers, councils, and global attention. Black business owners who held leases or freeholds suddenly found themselves negotiating from a position of strength. Some sold, others partnered. The smartest ones refinanced and expanded elsewhere. Median incomes in Lambeth don't always reflect this wealth because much of it is locked in property and businesses, not salaries. It's not uncommon to meet retirees in Brixton sitting on assets worth £1 to £2 million while living modestly. That mismatch between appearance and reality is part of why Brixton's wealth gets underestimated. There's also a strong professional class here now. Black creatives, executives, consultants, who choose Brixton deliberately. Not for affordability, but for identity. That choice keeps capital circulating locally instead of draining outward. Brixton proves something important. When culture owns space long enough, it becomes infrastructure. And infrastructure, once established, doesn't just support wealth, it multiplies it. And from here, we move into neighborhoods where Black wealth stops defending territory and starts defining entire boroughs. Number 2, Croydon, where scale turns survival into strategy. Croydon doesn't look like a wealth hub if you're scanning Instagram. It looks practical, busy, slightly chaotic. But that's exactly why it works. Because Croydon runs on scale, not symbolism. By sheer numbers alone, Croydon is one of the most important Black economic zones in London. It is home to the largest Black population by total residents, estimated at 85,000 to 90,000 people, with strong Nigerian, Ghanaian, Jamaican, and broader Caribbean representation. That density changes the math. When enough people live, spend, and invest in the same area, wealth stops leaking out as quickly. Money circulates, information travels faster, opportunity compounds. Property is the backbone here. Average house prices in Croydon range from £450,000 to £550,000, still significantly below inner London. That price gap allowed Black families to buy earlier, buy larger homes, and, crucially, buy more than one. Semi-detached houses became HMOs. Loft conversions turned into rental units. Family homes became multi-generational assets rather than single-use residences. I've heard this story more than once. One house bought just to live in quietly turns into the anchor for 3 income streams over 20 years. But Croydon isn't just about housing, it's a commuter wealth engine. Many Black professionals working in finance, healthcare, engineering, law, and public sector leadership choose Croydon deliberately. Fast rail links mean central London salaries can be paired with suburban ownership. Compare that to places like Hackney or Lambeth, where rising rents eat into earning power. In Croydon, the gap between income and expenses stays wide enough to invest. Another layer people overlook is business density. Croydon's high streets are packed with Black-owned salons, logistics firms, food wholesalers, accounting practices, IT consultancies, care providers, and retail operations. These businesses don't chase trend cycles, they chase demand. And demand here is constant, predictable, and local. Faith institutions also play a quiet but powerful role. Large Black-led churches function almost like informal chambers of commerce, circulating information about jobs, contracts, childcare, property, and capital. That reduces risk. It lowers the cost of starting something new. In many ways, Croydon operates like a city within a city. And now we move to the number one spot, the one Black neighborhood in London that feels almost impossible to exist. Number 1. Brent, when Black wealth becomes infrastructure. Brent earns the top spot because this is where Black wealth in London stops being individual and starts becoming systemic. Roughly 18 to 20% of Brent's population identifies as Black, with particularly dense clusters in Harlesden, Stonebridge, and parts of Wembley. But numbers alone don't explain Brent's position. What matters is ownership across layers: housing, retail, logistics, construction, events, transport-adjacent land, and institutions. This isn't one lane of success, it's an ecosystem. Property tells the first half of the story. Average prices now sit between £600,000 and £750,000, with Wembley regeneration pushing higher. Many Black homeowners bought decades ago, long before regeneration became policy language. That gap between purchase price and current value represents enormous locked-in equity, wealth that doesn't need to announce itself to be powerful. In contrast to places like Brixton, where gentrification often displaced ownership, Brent quietly held its ground. The second half is business. Brent hosts a dense network of Black-owned construction firms, property management companies, wholesalers, car dealerships, accountants, event operators, and import-export businesses. These aren't passion projects. They're infrastructure businesses. They employ people. They win contracts. They survive downturns. You don't need them to be cool, you need them to work. Wembley Stadium added an accelerant. Events created foot traffic. Foot traffic justified commercial leases. Commercial leases generated predictable cash flow. Predictable cash flow unlocked lending. And once lending enters the picture, growth becomes structural, not accidental. This is where Brent separates itself from other Black neighborhoods. Access to capital arrives after stability, not before. What stands out most is resilience. While other boroughs saw Black communities diluted through displacement, Brent absorbed growth internally. Families moved within the borough, not out of it. That preserved social capital, labor networks, and institutional memory. Children grew up seeing ownership as normal, not aspirational. Brent doesn't just host Black wealth, it functions with it. Roads, shops, homes, and businesses reinforce each other. At that point, wealth stops being a headline and starts behaving like infrastructure. And that's why Brent sits at number 1. And these were the richest Black neighborhoods that thrive in London. Which one of these areas impressed you the most? Let us know in the comments, and for more interesting peeks into Black wealth around the world, check out Black Status.